Hello, I'm Tracy Bolton, and this is Solving Locally Talk, a space for real conversations with people committed to accelerating economic prosperity and equity in Africa. From building economic empowerment to the role of media, we talk with investors, founders, international development professionals, and others doing the work to define a uniquely African roadmap. Honoring Black and Brown voices and perspectives, we learn, we share, we motivate, and we commit to action. I am super excited, y'all, for the first episode and my first guest, Miss Arena Dow. Arena is a seasoned international development professional with over 20 years advocating for the rights of children. She has worked across Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and knows firsthand the impact of inequity in the most vulnerable among us. Welcome, Irina. I am so glad you are joining us for this first episode of Solving Locally. Welcome.
Thank you, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be here. Always enjoy a chat with you.
You know, it's been 10 years now, wow, that we've known each other. I remember when we met in Democratic Republic of Congo, and you shared that your daughter, who was, I believe, then 14 at the time, was leaving for boarding school. My jaw dropped. At that time, my daughter was only like 4 or 5, so my brain could not wrap around going away to boarding school. I'm like, wow, she is like super mom, right? And I think you're still pretty super, Arena. So before we start, how are you? How is life? Let's get to the important things. How are you doing? How's life?
Well, thanks for asking. Life is good. I can't complain. I've learned to count my blessings in this world where there's so much misery, where human life does no longer seem to matter. So I take everything that's happening as a good thing. And, I'm learning on that. I'm leaning on that. And just like telling like it could be worse. But the funny thing is that when I say it could be worse, I felt like it was a positive, thing, right? I felt like I was saying the glass is half empty. But somehow some people see it otherwise. But just to say, to make a long story short, is that I'm fine. I'm counting my blessing and I cannot complain.
Yeah.
But before we move on, two things I wanted to say. First, that everything I'm going to be sharing here is like my own opinion, not that of the organization I'm working with. And the second thing is, if I may, I wanted to dedicate this conversation to my father who passed away recently. And he was also, a philosopher, a great philosopher, an Afro optimist, always thinking that Africa was on the right path, just taking its time, but would get there. He was working a lot on negritude, the position, the place of Africa on the continent, always striving to help people to reverse inequities. So I would really like to dedicate that conversation to him, if I may.
Absolutely. And what was your father's name? If you don't,
Stanislas Adotevi.
definitely dedicated to your father, in honor of your father. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so
Thank
grateful
you,
to
pleasure.
you for that. And you're absolutely right. I think for me, what I recognize, two things are helping me live this life right now. One, being in gratitude, because I recognize you can't be sad and grateful at the same time. They just don't work. So if I can focus on gratitude, that helps me. And also acceptance of what is. It doesn't mean you agree with it, but acceptance, I think for me, from a mental health perspective, is the gateway to peace, right?
Exactly.
And so that is something that I've really been really focused on and just helped me. So thank you for sharing. Well, as we begin this discussion, conversation actually, I just want to focus us. I really want to dive into the relationship between equity and prosperity, or actually more accurately, inequity and the lack of prosperity.
Yeah.
I know for myself personally, as an African American growing up in this country, I became aware of inequity very, very early. I didn't know what it was, but I could see it, I could feel it. And I think that's true for a lot of African Americans because inequity, I think, is part of the culture and the landscape of this country. So I'm very curious as for someone who didn't grow up in this country, who grew up in Africa, what is your first memory or what was your first experience with inequity?
I guess it's going to depend on how you define inequity. But as I was going through the examples I wanted to share, there's one that came to me actually this morning. Like, I remember in high school, so I was going to this French school. So it was like basically a school for, children of international civil servants. So basically for, coming from advantage, families and privileged families. And so many white, if I may use the term, but many, like, many foreigners, a few Africans, including myself. And then there was this homework we were given in philosophy, actually. And I got the best grade that time. And then I remember the teacher telling me, oh, if you actually wrote this paper, then you can teach the class with me, right? And I was like, oh,
Whoa.
why? Is she saying that because I'm black? Would have she said the same thing if it was another student, right? And then, like, it didn't even occur to her that my father was a philosopher himself, so he could guide me into, what reading. I had access to this huge library because he loved to read, so he was devouring books. So I had access to all this information. So I was like, I could not help but, wonder why she was asking me this. But then that's all talking about inequity, when I was a very young age, I was traveling. My father was also working in the development, area. And I would get the chance to travel to him in the field. And I remember, the first experience I had that was really like, oh, what is this? Like we went to, I love traveling with him, just like in the short story, but love traveling with him because like, it means skipping school. So it was great. I love that. But then we go to that place, right? So there had been a drought in that place of the part of the country. So we traveled by helicopter because the roads are bad. It will take us forever. We get there. And then we do find out that the populations there, like, the crops did not have any crops. So they ended up eating the water lilies, on the small, pond of water they had left. And I was like, I could not, I was still young and I could not really make sense of all the conversation. But I was like, why is it that they have to eat this when we just got on a helicopter to come and see them, right? Like, why is it like, do I deserve to be better off than they are? So I think that was the first crush that I had of inequity, like, thinking about that, the fact that I could eat whatever I wanted. And then these were parents who were basically struggling to give food to their children at the risk of, even poisoning them by giving food that was not edible, right? So I guess that would be my very first encounter. Probably before I had some, but like I think that's the one that really, I guess,
Wow.
defined what I wanted to do before later. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it influenced the trajectory of your life, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know for me, you made me think of an example. So I grew up in Chicago, South Side.
Mhm.
And this wasn't my first experience with it because I was a young adult. I think I was
Mhm.
20 and I was living on the South Side and I was dating a guy who was on the far North Side. And this
Mhm.
particular time, I decided to take the bus, right? From his house on this street called Halsted. Halsted Street is the longest street in Chicago. It goes from the far north side to the far south side. And just
Mhm.
what you see changing in that landscape, right? From wealth and privilege, right? And everything that comes with it, and the appearance of the homes, the upkeep of the neighborhood, to the severe poverty. That's something that stuck with me throughout my life,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And influenced what I do, where I volunteer, what I believe. But I
Exactly.
remember being so sad by that. So thank you so much for sharing that story. So following up on that, now I know
Mhm.
you did your academic undergrad and graduate studies in the United States, correct?
Yeah. if you
Yeah.
want. I did my undergrad in the UK.
Oh, in the UK. Okay.
Yeah,
And then graduate work in the United States. And you've
exactly.
lived here for work. So, how long have you lived in the United States off and on?
Ooh, I would say 10 years.
Oh, so a while, a
10 years.
while.
Yeah, a while, a while.
Okay. So my question is, as someone who's really lived in the United States and lived in Africa, of course you've lived other places, but you've lived a
Mhm,
long time in both of those places.
mhm.
How does inequity look different? How is it different in the US versus in Africa?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good and tough question. Like, thinking about it, I'm not sure it looks really different from one place to another. Like for me, it takes the same face, right? Whether you're looking at a person or a child begging on the street, or looking at somebody who's going through garbage for food. I guess the difference would be that maybe in the US it would be more striking because you think, oh, this is the land of opportunities. So why is it that people have to do that to survive? Why is it that people have to do that to eat? Why is it that in a country so rich, you don't have universal medical coverage and that people actually find themselves on the street because they could not pay for medical care, right? And somehow it does not seem to be posing any problem to most people. But then coming back to the Africa, I grew up in, I recall like, I don't recall having so many people begging on the street at the time, because like somehow there did seem to be a social support system in place to
Mm,
prevent that. And of course, things have changed now, right? We're talking about like globalization, and I think it definitely did have an impact on the economic situation in Africa. But now the gap, the divide between the rich and the less well off is so big. Then it has become endemic, and you see more and more people begging on the street. And I mean, it's like it's not necessarily locals. No, of course, you have children, you have the Talibans, but then you also have a more and more like refugees,
mm,
internally displaced person. So I guess it's different, but I think what's the difference between the two is really also the fact that the way, and it's changing, of course, no, but the way Africa is portrayed in the
mm,
media, right?
yeah.
Somehow it's a bit as if you are expecting to see that, as if it's normal to see that in Africa, right? And as if like poverty and misery is actually normal, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
nearly accepted as a norm when it's not the case, right? So I guess for me, I think the difference would be in terms of perception, really, but then also looking at the culture, the way people are perceived, right? So I always like to share that in the sense, like when you're in Africa, if you are well off, if you have money, if you know people, then you are not expecting to um, queue in a line. You are not expecting to,
Ooh.
when you apply for, for documents, for example. I mean, it's so much easier than the normal people. So I think this is also
Yeah.
another type of iniquity, not how it's really actually transfers to your day-to-day life, day-to-day activities, and how it's again making the divide even bigger because those are things that um, the poorest or the poor don't have access to.
It's so interesting that you touched on, well, perception, and we'll get to that and the role of perception. But the media, that is so fascinating to me because one of the things I've traveled quite a bit, not as much as you, of course, but I
Oh, I'm sure
remember
you did.
being in small villages, right,
Mhm,
and poor, and there would be one television, and blasting on that television would be some program from the United States. And
mhm,
that's when I had that aha moment, as Oprah says, where I recognized, oh, they are forming impressions, the
mhm,
power of that media, right?
mhm,
To that population, defining for them to some extent what life could be or even should be in many cases, right?
mhm,
And on the flip side of that, to your point, the role of the media as it's portraying what Africa is like, right?
mhm,
And instilling this belief of, in my opinion, less than, or there's always poverty. It's just the nature of the game there, which is really fascinating for me. But you're right. At some level, it does look the same, the day to day, right? You don't have enough for your food, for your family. So it's fascinating. And I want to just pull on something you mentioned about globalization, right? And so my question is, how do you think, or do you think, but I think you've already answered that question, globalization blocks and limits prosperity in Africa specifically? What are your thoughts on that? It could be capital infusion, it could be so many things.
Yeah, I think it does limit it in various ways, right? So again, it's the balance in terms of power, right? So like for example, if Africa has the most of the or many, mineral resources, right?
Yeah.
But they don't have control over it, right? So then in that game, if I may use the word game, that globalization is. So you have like, there's very much there's a lot of imbalance in terms of power. So we have the mineral resources, we don't have control over it. So of course, in the end, who loses? The continent or the people who cannot sell the resources that they have when they can sell it. But even when they can, it's not always that they can sell it, but even when they can sell it, it's definitely the prices are not determined by the African continent, right? We also have like, beyond the resources, the mineral resources and everything, we also have like a lot of youth there. So we also have like human capital, right? But are we able to sell it? Maybe not, because most of these youth, they have not received an education, or many of them, they have not been trained. They feel that they don't even have access to the information, the resources to be on their own, to fend on themselves. So what's the solution they find? Just die, going through a desert or, pussy,
Oh
trying
my
to go
gosh.
where they feel that it's, things are better. So that's why I'm saying, in this game or in this equation, as long as we don't take control over what it is that we have or what it is that we have to offer, it's going to be very difficult for the continent to be able to take advantage of that. Of course, we're getting there, right? You have social media, the youth know more, they know what their rights are, what is available to them, what is not. They talk to each other, they support each other. So things are going to trend. And when you see the movement, the things that are happening in Western Africa, for example, or in the Sahel countries, it's again the youth wanted to take, to
Yeah.
change that imbalance and having better control of what it is that, they
Yeah.
have.
Because I've always been fascinated with why Africa doesn't control the resources. I remember a few years, I mean, I kind of a little bit understand the historical perspective, right? And the rights, right? Mining rights versus transformation rights, where the real money is, right? The transformative, right? You get the ore, you get the coal, but in its raw state, it's completely, making up a number. Let's say it's a dollar a pound or a dollar an ounce, but once you transform it, right, it's 50. Because I remember this huge
Exactly.
diamond,
Yeah.
the largest one was mined or found somewhere 3 years ago. And of course, it's Dutch, so it bothers me on so many levels, but I'm so encouraged. And I want to know, and we'll get to this in solutioning, how do we take that back? Right? So you look at minerals, for example, that are coming out of DRC, right? So how do we take that back? And how do you, just briefly, why is that maintained, right? If those minerals, just for our audience, just to educate us, if you own those minerals, the rights, where is that disconnect? Why can't we control them throughout that supply chain?
Um, I'm sure you have the answer, right?
I
Okay, I'm
don't
not a
know. Tell me
politician. I
the
know I don't want to
obvious.
do
The
politics.
obvious
But
eludes me most of the time.
yeah, but I mean, again, it's like, I do believe that things happen. in cycles, right? And today, most people believe that like Europe would not have been able to develop itself, or even the US would not have been able to develop itself if it was not for African labor, right? That Europe would not have been able to develop itself if it was not for the resources, from Africa and any other places in that. So basically, I mean, and I think it's like it's not human, but it's economic, right? So basically, if I need something, what do I do in order to be able to ensure that I keep access to those things, right? So if I give the right, or if I give, the African governments, or if I give the others the opportunity, the latitude to control what it is that, I need to have access to at the least cost possible, of course I stand to lose, right? So like if you look at the petroleum crisis, right? This is exactly the same thing that happened, like, the Arab states saying, okay, now we want to have control over petroleum, right? And again, it's a battle, right? So it's like the more I control things, the better off I am. So maybe create situations or ensure that I do keep this control as long as I can. But again, as you say, as I just said before, things are changing, right? We have more information. We know what it is that we cannot do. We know where to go for help. Like, if you look at West Africa, for example, the CFA francs, I'm sure you've heard a lot of the controversy going over the CFA francs, the fact that it's not printed in Africa, but by the French. So there's a lot of controversy about it. But again, this is another way, to control.
Yeah.
The governments, the countries, the populations, the resources that those countries have access to. So that's that's my personal explanation of what is going on. But again, as I said before, things are changing, and we would get there.
They are changing, and you brought up something that I want to transition into solutioning, right? Some of the things that, particularly you who've been in it and have been on the ground, right? Some of the things that you've seen that work and maybe don't work, right? As far as putting in place mechanisms to accelerate economic equity, and what could we do different, or what needs to be done different, in your opinion? Some of the things that you've seen that are working that maybe we can expand on.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it starts with, if I'm talking about like programming, I think it will start with building the capacity of the population, the workforce that we have that is available, to us or to the African continent. Because unless, and I want to talk about like, really demographic dividend here, unless we give all these young people in Africa, like the tools, the education, the life skills, the incubators, the access to the resources that they need to be able to be self-efficient, to become entrepreneurs instead of waiting for civil service job that's never going to come to them. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to change the equation. But also I wanted to talk about the fact that we need to be able, like, to co-create things, but also be in charge of what it is that, we want to do, be able to define our own development agenda on our own growth agenda. What does it mean for us? Instead of having it being defined by others, right? And unless we do that, it's going to be very difficult to change things. But also, beyond that, you also have to understand that nobody is going to do things for us. And it doesn't matter.
Preach.
It's like, I know there's a lot of controversy about like,
Preach, girl.
Africa is going to China, Africa is going to Russia. I think you have to understand, and I think we do understand that, our salute is not going to be coming from those countries. Right?
Yes.
Those are just partners that can help us at a given amount of time or at a given, place in time. But eventually, we want to become equal partners into that venture we are engaging in. And unless we realize that, unless we understand that, and unless we are negotiating as partners, it's going to be very, very difficult to change.
I love that. And I
how to
think,
reverse
oh,
things. Yeah.
and I love that. And I think we're seeing that in the youth. One of the things that excites me is the African free trade area, right?
Mm-hmm.
That which basically I think has been signed by 53 of the 54 African countries and ratified by 43 or 47. That movement, free movement of goods and services, I think
Services,
creates
yeah.
huge opportunities. And one of the questions that I was going to ask you, but you've answered, is do we have allies in this? Obviously, we have allies, but I think you hit it right on the nerve. This is something Africa has to take control of and own. So I agree with you 100,000% on that. And I'm super excited. I think we have, from my travels, I think we have the youth that believe that as well. And
Yeah.
be it because of social media, everyone wants to own their own thing. And I think that is a huge potential or asset for Africa, the fact that it's such a young population on the continent, and it's getting more and more connected, by the day, by the month, by the year
Yeah.
across
And
the
that is
continent.
eager to do things, to create things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And to add to that, there's also the fact, like I'm looking, we mentioned our daughters before we started, but I'm looking at all these young children, African Americans, right? Who are from Africa, have grown up in Africa or in the US, have studied there. So basically they have a bit of both worlds, right?
Yes.
And that are one day going to being willing to come back to Africa and say, okay, what is it that I can contribute to that
Yes.
continent? So they will have the knowledge, they will have the access to the resources, they will have access to, the connections
Yeah.
to make that happen. So I also believe that those children will be able to make a difference, because they'll be like, talking about my daughter and my son, for example, they're like, okay, when I'm done here, I'm getting the experience, but then I'm going back home. So I can do
Exactly.
for Africa, right?
Yes.
Noting that for them, of course, home is both places, right? The US, but and Africa, but still, they feel that they have a role to play into
And that's
the development
huge.
of that continent.
And yeah, that's huge. I agree. And one of the last things I want to say as we wrap up is I know people, they've moved their families back to Africa. They're young children and they're bringing them up and raising them. Wow, we did it, Irina. We did a first episode. It's a wrap, and I feel good, just like the Godfather soul. So thank you so much. But in our last minute, I just want us to share with our audience something that we showcase about the continent that we feel good about. Very briefly, I'll go first. I think I've already said mine, but I am super excited about the African free trade area and what that is opening up for the continent. And I think the world needs to be super excited. And as my sister would say, maybe a little afeared, because Africa's about to pop. Your turn.
I think for me, it's like the humanity of Africa, right? So we are, you may be losing it, but I think we're really people who care, and then we can support each other, and then we can make things change. So I think for me, it's like the few words I will live with is like, paying it forward. If that concept of paying forward
Yes.
really is really applied in Africa, in that context where people care so much for each other, I do believe that it's also going to be able to change the
Thank
equation
you. And
and take Africa where it is supposed to be.
absolutely, thank you. And to our audience, I would like to give you 3 action items. First, check out the website. It's on your screen. Look for the next day and time of our next Solving Locally talk. And then I'd like to give you an action item, #African Success. Go share with us things that you know that are happening on the continent. And thank you so much. arena. I think you're in France right now. Hopefully, I'll get to see you sometime. I think you'll be back. But thank you for doing this. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Tracy. Anytime. You know where to
Oh,
find
thank
me.
you. Thank you.